Hi, everyone, and welcome to the session Beware SQL Injection in Azure Data Factory and Synapse Pipelines. My name is Mathias Halkjaer Petersen. In my daily life, I work as a principal architect in data analytics at a company called Philomine. I also run a blog called FluxBI, where I tend to write about topics in the overlap between Power BI and Azure Synapse Analytics. I've been looking very much forward to today to talk about the risk of SQL injection in pipelines and what we can do to mitigate it. Agenda here, we will talk about what is SQL injection, then explore if it is even possible to inject SQL into ADF and Synapse, and finally we'll talk about if we need to and how we can mitigate it. So let's dive into it. First of all, what is SQL injection? SQL injection is a common known risk in application development. So let's imagine we have a simple application here with a web client, a web application, and a database server. It's some sort of booking site, and we have an option for the user to enter their booking number, and we give them back some information. Everything is fine. They can add booking number. As you can see, it generates an HTTP request, converts that into a SQL statement in the application level itself, and then sends that SQL statement to the backend. It's not really any problems with this, except if a malicious actor actually tries to circumvent this and make some harm. They can modify the entry and add some logic that will alter the output of the SQL statement. So as we go along, this change will, in fact, open up for the possibility of this malicious user to get not just one booking number, but actually get all booking numbers from the system. And that is the risk of SQL injection. If you don't sanitize and protect your inputs into also dynamically generated SQL statements, well, then you run the risk of giving your user more power than you want them to have. And that's not it. I mean, that's getting access to more data than we should have. But what if you then inserted data, you drop tables, drop databases, or created databases? Well, then we have even bigger problems. So the question here is, now that we know what SQL injection is, can we uh, can we do the same thing in Data Factory or with Data Factory and Synapse? So let's say we have some metadata files set up in our data pipelines. So we have classical metadata files defining uh, source, columns, schema, tables, and stuff like that. It can be tables stored in your data lake, or even saved as a CSV file or something like that. Anything metadata driven. It could be a SQL table as well. Well, in this case, we have this in our data lake. Then we have some pipelines, looks at these metadata, and then starts ingesting the tables based on these metadata. In this case, we're generating a dynamic query using the query function of copy activity. And we generate a dynamic query that will take an input of columns and tables and schema, and then choose those for our data copy. This is a pretty classical metadata-driven data lake setup. Probably you wouldn't have used a query, but for the sake of testing this out, we do it here. Now, what is the problem here? The problem, of course, is if we again introduce a malicious actor. Imagine someone who's gotten access to our data lake, and they actually fiddle with some of these metadata. And instead of just adding them down like we expect them to add them, they actually configure them in a way where they can manipulate with these SQL statements. So let's say they added something like in the instance before. Well, they can go in and do this because we are using this query function, but also because we have a dynamic expression defining our query statement inside it. Then that will generate a SQL query. And if we added something bad, well, we could add something like star from sales orders, semicolon, and then drop table. And eventually we would drop a table from the data source if we had the access. Or we could even drop the nuclear bomb and drop the whole database. Boom, gone, no more data source. And this is not just our data warehouse that's at risk because we are actively connecting to our data sources. So we're talking about production and operation systems here that are at risk if we haven't mitigated this risk. So this is the hypothesis that we can do this. Let's explore if it's actually possible in real life. I'm excited. I hope you are too. Let's dive into it. So let's try to do some SQL injection. In this case, it's actually very simple because we have our metadata inside a table storage in a data lake. So all we need to do is to go to that metadata, change one of them, do a trigger little code that will fool the engine, drop the whole database, and then make a new select statement just to not make any fuss about errors or stuff like that. Click the update, and that's all we need to do. We just set up the SQL injection. Next thing to do is just to wait for the next pipeline run and see everything. But so now the pipeline has run, and as you can see, the database is gone. So what else can we do? How about creating a bunch of new databases at the highest price tier? Same principle, just go to the metadata definitions, add this huge SQL statement that will create 20 new databases, all at the highest database tier. Update it, wait for the pipeline to finish again. This time it's probably going to take a bit longer, in this case took 20 minutes, but then checking out the server again, it will have now a bunch of new databases. And you know what? These are not cheap. These databases will be um, catastrophic, and just hope that the client detects it in time. Great. So we found out that it is in fact possible to do SQL injection if we use the query functions in our data factory or Synapse. So what should we consider and do about mitigating this problem? So there are a bunch of things that we can do that I'd like to talk very briefly about. So we can set up environment isolation and code reviews. So we can make sure that there are proper dev, test, and prod environments with proper code reviews so that there is some control that changes like this are actually not inserted into our production systems with production access. Furthermore, we can set up proper policies around access control and minimize the privileges of our service account. So if the service account in our case only had read access, it would not have been able to delete either tables or databases, or for that sake, created new databases. So minimizing privileges are also important, but also minimizing the access control of our users, our data engineers, into the metadata files. That would have also added another barrier, another protection layer. And finally, even though all our protection fails, it's always a good idea to also set up some auditing. So at the end of the day, that we can catch uh, who made the possibly catastrophic fail, and if it was internal or something external. And finally, um, for non-advanced users, just avoiding dynamic queries can be a very easy, quick way to ensure that you don't run into this problem. So thank you so much for having me today. If you have any questions based on what I've just talked about in this quick lightning talk, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn, and I'll be more than happy to answer questions that we don't have time for now. So have a nice day and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.